Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of another double bill day. Now, as you know, we've done a couple of shows recently about SAS Rogue Heroes, and one of the most developed characters in Season 2 is Sergeant Reg Seekings. And we are delighted to welcome Tony Rushmer, who has written this fab book on Reg, which arrived yesterday afternoon at 4 or 5 o'clock. It couldn't have arrived any later in preparation for today's show, but I was able to read several chapters last night. The link to purchasing it is, of course, in the description below. So we're going to bring him in now. Good morning, Tony. How are you today?
Paul, good morning. Thanks so much for having me on to talk about Reg. I look forward to having our conversation.
Brilliant. And we're going to bring up some slides and some pictures, but it's amazing that this has happened with your work on this, all coinciding with this tidal wave of interest in Reg and the men of the SAS and SRS. But tell us before we begin how you came to the project, because sports journalist by trade, now you've joined the ranks of military historian.
Not quite sure I can say I'm a fully qualified, fully paid up military historian, Paul, but I have been delighted to have researched and written about Reg, and it came about in slightly unlikely circumstances, really. As you say, I'm a sports journalist, and we had lockdowns, didn't we, and which prevented any sport from taking place at certain stages early on, and kind of I was kicking my heels looking for things to do, and like the rest of the populace, channel hopping, and I landed on Ben McIntyre's really insightful documentary series, based around his book, Rogue Warriors. And I'd shown little or no interest in the detail of World War II until I actually watched this. But it included archive footage recorded with those first men of the SAS that was recorded in the 1980s. And obviously Reg Seekings was one of them. And I'm sat here in the Fens, okay? So I'm sat here in the middle of the Fens in Cambridgeshire, and Seekings was vivid. He was compelling. A lot of people will have seen how he described quite a lot of those incidents that occurred during those first days of the SAS, and he had me gripped without a doubt. And so, like we all do, I Googled him, and blow me, I found out he was born 1.5 miles from where I was actually watching the program that had so grabbed my interest. And so that got me in, that hooked me. Reg was a compelling character, but the fact that it was a local history story 1 mile or so away across the fields here in the Fens made me want to know more. So obviously went and bought Ben's excellent book, then started reading excellent work by Gavin Mortimer, who, by the way, was really helpful throughout the process. I emailed Gavin on certain occasions, and he was really generous with his time, as was another one of your guests, Tom Petch, and Damien Lewis. What a brotherhood they are, the SAS writers. Yeah. But the point being, I got more and more interested in the subject. And the year after I'd sort of had my interest peaked, in the spring of 2021, the bypass bridge between where I live and where Seekings was born was named in his honor, Seekings Way. And so I thought, right, I've got to get up and running here. I've got to do something about this. And I became acquainted with the guy who's X2 para, Gil Boyd, who was brilliant. He put me in touch with not quite the world, but seemingly everyone that would enable me to pave the way to writing. So the SAS Regimental Association, the Seekings family, he knew one of Reg's nephews who was in the paras, and also he knew Reg's niece who was in the Cambridgeshire Police. So suddenly I was up and running. I'd had all these contacts, had all this access, and there was absolutely no reason why I couldn't sit down and start writing the book, which is what I did.
Well, brilliant stuff. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is with the so-called elite units. And I'm not saying that they weren't elite. I'm saying that's a word we attribute that we don't really know how to break it down. SAS, Delta Force, Navy SEALs, whatever it would be, is the veterans of those units from whichever war tend to have two personalities. There's the kind of the bravado, dismissing all the fear, rough and tumble, we're all blokes together kind of point of view, and then more of a private, the dealing with losing your friends and dealing with being in some really, really up close and personal engagements. And that's one of the things that's being debated about with the TV series, is whether the characters are a little bit one note, some of them, and some of them are a little bit just sort of random hard man in the background. But how difficult is it to just get to grips with who Reg was as a person? Because how much did these men ever really reveal of that?
What an excellent question. So the Reg that I read about was the man who we kind of all think about when we think of Reg Seekings, granite hard, single-minded, rough, tough. I mean, he actually said himself he was a rough, tough so-and-so. So he didn't necessarily help himself in that respect in terms of a one-dimensional presentation. However, there was so much more to Reg Seekings. And it was through... So Gordon Stevens wrote a fantastic book. He interviewed all those men in the 1980s, and he wrote a fantastic book. I actually have it quite close by. I shouldn't be promoted, but I'd like to promote Gordon's book because it's really good. The Originals, The Secret History of the SAS in their own words. And so, those 17 audio reels, I listened to them. Gordon helped pave the way for me to listen to them there with the IWM. And I just got to grips with Reg to the point where I'd go to bed at night and, I'd kind of hear his solid, sure assertions running through my mind. And I really started to get a feel for the type of guy he was, which I'm from the Cambridgeshire Fens. He's from the Cambridgeshire Fens. Now, I'm not saying I have his wile or guile at all, but I could tell the survivor instinct, that natural decisiveness, that clear-mindedness. It was all starting to filter through. And at the same point, I had the really good fortune to get in contact with a private collector who had 12 exercise books of Reg Seeking's thoughts on North Africa in the early days of the SAS. As you can see, the slide we're showing here, exercise books.
I mean, that's that kind of priceless assistance that without that, I'm sure the book would have been nowhere near as good as it was, because it's the thoughts at the time, isn't it? Because as you say, by the time these men interviewed in the 1980s, they've collected some of their thoughts, they've revised some of their ideas, they've had time to grow up, they've cross-checked with each other in some ways. But at the time, there's nothing beats that contemporary writing when you're experiencing these events in real time.
Well, these were recorded just after the war, in the years that followed the war. So they are very fresh in the mind for Reg. And he writes them down, by which point in his life, he's a landlord in Ely, in a pub in Ely, and he's writing down just page after page, to the point where some of these books, he's written on the inside front cover, the inside back cover. It's clearly pouring out of him. He needs to get it out. It's an outlet for him. And as you say, these notebooks, which were much more contemporaneous than the 1980s interviews, which were brilliant, absolutely brilliant, but period of time had elapsed. There'd only been a handful of years had elapsed when Reg wrote these. So it's all fresh in his mind. And that makes things like his Operation Squatter description, his descriptions of the first successful raid, which was Thamet Aerodrome in December 1941. It just cast fresh light on them for me, and certainly cast fresh light on them for Seeking's role in that raid, specifically at Thamet, which we can discuss because he was part of that 6-man patrol commanded by Paddy Mayne that led that first successful operation, which validated the SAS. So yes, those notebooks were absolutely magnificent. And just so that anyone who's looking at that photo will know, there's Reg in the middle, and in front of him is his great pal Johnny Cooper. So to get back to your point,
sorry, just to interrupt, I'm glad you mentioned he absolutely is one of the originals, because one of the shortcomings with the second season of Rogue Heroes is it's not portraying the number of men that are by that point in one SAS, SRS, then Sec 2 SAS. It's like a couple of dozen guys. But when Reg is joining, it really genuinely is a couple of dozen guys. It is the absolute formation of this. And we had a quick question before we leave the Fens. Ian Carr is saying, did he have a Fens accent?
Yes. So it wasn't. I think it changed by the time the audio was recorded, but I can hear definite Fen in among the more sort of clipped military precision with which he delivered. And by that point, the 1980s, remember, he'd lived in southern Rhodesia from the mid-50s through to the early 80s. So some of the rural intonation had probably softened, and he wasn't quite as rural fen as some of the people that live around here now. But I could, without shadow of a doubt, hear the local dialect, which was why I went to Google that night to find out exactly where he was from, and it was 1.5 miles away up Quainey Drove, which is the most remote spot you can imagine in the vicinity of Ely.
Brilliant. So let's talk about those first raids, those first days out with the brand new SAS.
So okay, in the summer of 1941, Reg was coming out of the disbanded Lay Force. This was Bob Laycock's formation that had been involved in the fighting withdrawal in Crete and other operations. Numbers had diminished, and so there were all these men at Geneva Depot, Reg being one of them, when David Stirling, newly promoted to captain, arrives to explain that he is setting up a mobile dynamic force, that the schedule is to work in small patrols deep behind the lines and carry out assaults on transport park-ups, air bases, basically hit and hurt Rommel's lines of communication. Reg is sold when he hears the word parachutist from his days in the Cambridgeshire Regiment, in 1939, early 1940. That's what he wanted to become, a parachutist, but size had been potentially against him, he was told. So he's got this chance to do what he wants, become a parachutist. So he tells David Stirling that he'd love to join. This is a short interview after Stirling's sort of elevator pitch. And so, he tells him I was a boxing champion, a divisional boxing champion before the war, which he was, a light heavyweight, February 1939. And he tells him that he's a keen cyclist. Stirling's obviously impressed by his physical appearance and also his athleticism. And he's in. So he joins L Detachment of the freshly, he joins L Detachment, and which is Stirling's startup of maybe, I think it's 60 men and half a dozen officers. They train under Jock Lewis. They attempt Operation Squatter, which we all know was an abject failure based on the fact they've hurled themselves out of planes into a biblical storm. Once on the ground, they lose men in the jump, and they hit this terrible storm that means they return without having landed a single blow. That's November 1941. Just a few weeks later, they're back out there again, and this time they're going to target Surt and Thamet. David Stirling takes a small patrol, or is targeting Surt. Paddy Mayne is placed in charge of Thamet. So it's December the 14th. We can see the map there you've shown, and if you just want to see the Great Sand Sea to the west of that is JLO Oasis. I've put it in slightly bigger font so people can clearly see that. JLO Oasis was the forward operating base with the LRDG as their chauffeurs. Rather than go in by parachute this time, they're inserting with the LRDG's expertise. So they go northwest, and as you can see, there's Surt and there's Thamet right on that Libyan coastline. And it's Mayne who takes the 6-man patrol onto Thamet Aerodrome. Reg, in his notebooks, writes about how he smells petrol on the air. He had a particularly strong, he was very good with his sense of smell, and he could smell petrol in the air. And he also saw a post which suggested that there was, a landing ground. But before they can find the planes, because they're looking for the Messerschmitt fighters and also the Stuka bombers, and before they find those planes, they hear Italian voices. So that's when Mayne steps in and says, I'll take the larger building, because they spot 2 larger buildings. And Harold Chalky White, West Brom footballer, and Reg are deployed to stalk the smaller hut. People know, it's legend, SAS legend. Mayne walks into the mess room with the enemy airmen. Good evening. And of course, he and his small patrol party shoot up that place. At the same point, Reg is dodging tracer fire from the smaller hut along with Chalky White. They rejoin Paddy, then retrace the steps back to where they could smell octane in the air, sure enough, bingo, there's the landing ground full of fighters, bombers, and Paddy proceeds to jump into an Italian biplane. I think it was a CR-42. He jumps in, and of course, with his bare hands, rips out the dashboard. Now, Reg describes that in his exercise book, and he basically says, our first aircraft, we couldn't believe what we were seeing. None of us acted the true Englishman, was his quote, the last part. They were that excited. They were up and running. Sterling's men were up and running, and Paddy, of course, had led the way. And that then triggered havoc across that landing ground as the whole patrol laid their Lewis bombs, of course, invented by the genius Jock Lewis. And they got out of there with 24 aircraft, as well as bomb dumps, petrol dumps, ablaze behind them. And the efficacy of Sterling's blueprint was proved. It worked. Small patrol insertion, unconventional warfare. This was the way forward. There was success. And it was from there that obviously the North African campaign was fought in conjunction with the LRDG's assistance over the following months. Before the following summer, they got their own transport. And there's a picture you put up there as part of the research process. I was really lucky that I was put in touch with Mike Sadler, whose last years of his life were spent near Cambridge, which was obviously proximity to the Fens. And I had that incredible good luck to sit with Mike. Days, long days. I'd go in and we'd have a bit to eat. We'd have a coffee and we'd talk. And while this Centurion's faculties were not quite what they were in the 1940s, certainly his mind was. It was as sharp and humorous as ever. And if anyone taught me about the atmosphere of the North African desert, it was Mike. Just to sit and listen to him was one of the greatest privileges I've ever had.
And I love the bit in your book where you said your first phone call had to be interrupted halfway through to put the kettle on and have a cup of tea. Extraordinary. And what a legend that guy is. And for what we were saying at the beginning, Tony, that 80 plus years on from the events of North Africa, trying to get to that mindset of these guys, because it's all very well. You've used these amazing primary sources and the war diaries and speaking to Gavin about his research and these other people. But speaking to Mike, you get that kind of direct telephone line, but in person to someone who was actually there at the time. It must have been extraordinarily beneficial for you.
It was in so many ways, because as I just hinted at there, it gave me a feel of Cairo. So, he'd tell me what an incredibly lively, bustling place it was, and the small detail would come from Mike along the lines of, but you wouldn't put your wrist, you wouldn't put your arm out of the car with your wristwatch on in case you slowed down and someone took sight of it and perhaps grabbed it off your wrist. So he was able to give me an idea of this vibrant, lively place where you had to be on your toes. But at the same stage, he also taught me of his love of the desert. The stark contrast from the lively setting that was Cairo to this bleak, desolate, open sea space. The desert ocean, and the cold nights. We talked about how bitterly cold it could be. We talked about the heat and the desert sores. So yes, it was, right until the last weeks of his life. I went to see him a couple of weeks before he died just over a year ago, early January the 4th, 2024. And I'd been in a couple of weeks beforehand, and we were still talking about operations. And he was telling me about the descent from the Jebel into Benghazi, the delayed descent that got them to the edge of Benghazi too late for Operation Bigamy. And he still had razor sharp recollections at the age of nearly 104, 103 in 10 months.
Well, you've made us all jealous, but of that. But what an amazing guy. And I remember that, I don't know if it was you, said someone put it on social media, someone who visited him very, very late on, and by which time, as you know, he was nearly blind. And this, I think it was a woman journalist, offered to go to the kitchen for him to put the kettle on. He said something like, "Young lady, I was able to find my way through the desert 1,000 miles at a time. I can find my way to my own kitchen," he said. And it just made me laugh at the kind of guy he was.
And he would have delivered it with a smile and with a lightness of touch, because that was Mike's unusual charm. And he was a man who was more interested, certainly he was more interested in what you'd been doing than what the extraordinary things he'd done. You know, he'd want to know what you were growing in your garden, that type of man, which made him an absolute joy to be around. And legend is bandied around, isn't it? But that man undoubtedly is legendary.
Was a legend.
SAS status,
Now, one of the issues you had is that Reg and his wife, of course, never had any kids of their own. So you had to rely on the extended family. His brother Bob, who was also SAS, and then, you know, nephews and nieces and people in the village. And you know, so let's go back right to the beginning now and paint a picture of the early life of Reg and what we were talking before going live, that where you think some of these qualities came from.
So there's a picture of Reg in his I would suggest late teens. He's with his father, Albert. So Albert was a professional soldier in the Bedfordshire Regiment who fought in the Great War and suffered severe injury, shrapnel wounds, which, according to his family, left him with a wound so big in his back you could put your fist in it. So he lay 3 days alone in no man's land and was a dutiful, hard soldier, and came back and instilled in the young Reg, the importance of duty. You must do your duty. And he aside from that, he was a quiet man, a farm worker, which obviously Reg, when he left school age 14, followed in his father's footsteps, much against his wishes, but that was necessary at the time. They literally lived in a tied cottage to a farm, and he needed to assist. So that was his father, and there's a picture of his mother as well that I sent you. Now, she was a very different lady, Annie. So Annie, she was the sort of woman who, I remember being told by one of her grandchildren that when a game of Ludo turned against her one Christmas, she grabbed hold of the Ludo board and hurled it into the fire. So she was as loud, boisterous, and competitive a person, and as Albert was understated, really. And obviously, Reg was influenced by both of those: the sense of duty, toughness, hardiness, and also remember the landscape. So around here, this neck of the woods at this time of the year, it's blooming cold. You know, there's not much between you and Siberia if the wind's coming in off the north, and it feels bitter. But those men went to work long weeks, long months, long years, and that shaped them. They were tough. So when Reg needed to go to the North African desert, he was able to cope with extremes of temperature, because here in the summer, there's nowhere to hide in the sunshine, in the high heat. So he was used to extremes. And he had two parents that influenced him in very different ways. His mum gave him possibly that fiery disposition, that fire in his belly, and his father instilled a sense of duty. And I shared a picture of Reg as a young man, as you can see there. You know, he was a strapping young lad. That he probably will have been 16, 17. I don't know. It's hard to judge. But at that point in his life, he was planning boxing as a route out of the Fens, because he didn't want to live and work his 70 on the fields. And he was a good boxer. Indeed, one fight report I read described him as Seekings the Mixer, full of heavy wallops. And that fight was actually against Pat Riley, another SAS original, bizarrely. They fought in Wisbech in early 1939. But the next time they saw each other was at Cabrit. What are you doing here? Same as you, mate. You know, they both joined David Sterling's nascent unit in late August.
I think it is interesting, Tony. It's interesting that in those early days of the SAS, when no one quite knew in which direction the SAS was going, I mean, literally and figuratively in terms of navigation, they didn't know what qualities they would need for the future SAS, because they haven't really, even Sterling and Lewis, those guys, they hadn't really kind of formulated exactly what it was going to be. But sports and sports prowess seemed to be a way the founders had of looking for people who had the right qualities. You know, Paddy Mayne himself, of course, and not always, but you've got to find some means of separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And it seems that early hardcore unit did have that sports, be it boxing, be it rugby, be it a combination of everything. It's certainly a competitive nature. If it isn't directly in sport, it's that competition was something that Sterling was looking for.
I think that must have been, yes, as you said, it must have been so hard to sort the wheat from the chaff. And, you know, I mentioned Harold White, Chalky White, the West Bromwich Albion footballer that Reg was alongside
Yeah.
at Tammet. So there's another one. You've mentioned Paddy Mayne, British Lions Ireland rugby star, Reg, divisional boxing champion. So sporting prowess is an indicator, isn't it, of toughness, mental toughness. If you're a champion elite sportsman, you have to have granite hardness to succeed. And that's still the same. You know, as a sports journalist to this day, I see lots of talented sportsmen but the ones that are really elite have all got that inner fire. Tiger Woods was the absolute prime example for me when I was covering the Masters. You know, he had that toughness that others they were tough, but he was tougher as well as better. So absolutely. You're right. I think that Sterling will have looked at sporting prowess as a key performance indicator. I think KPI. And there's three guys here. That's this picture that we're showing. So Reg there, obviously, 1941. He's part of Lay Force at this point. In the middle, these are both Fenmen alongside him, one of whom is his brother, Bob. Bob was a great long-distance runner, good athlete, good sportsman, and he would end up in the SAS as well, as would Eric Musk, the man in the middle there. He was an excellent local footballer who, by reputation, was looked at by a top-level Scottish club. I don't know which one, but I heard an interview with Reg where he actually said Eric was a brilliant footballer. The other thing about Eric was his handshake. It was a bone crusher. So these were physical, strong men. And in the case of Bob, he possibly wasn't as strong as Reg or Eric, but he had that long-distance runner quality. So stamina, durability. As we say, we're honing in on something here, Paul, I think.
No, absolutely. And, you know, the thing is that the people who are watching this, a lot of them are going to be fresh from SAS Rogue Heroes. And there were bits about the second season I didn't like, bits I did like, but Reg is absolutely given the development that he didn't get in the first series, where in the first series, because Theo playing him is a bit one of those sort of muscle-bound kind of moderns, he almost is like a background character, like one of the second line of Expendables kind of people. It's like he's there, he's obviously tough, but he's not really given much dialogue in terms of just, come on then, let's do this. And but you know, Bob as well, in your writing, both Bob and Reg and one of the other guys you talk about, they are showing these signs of human, I'm not going to say frailty, but there's a PTSD certainly loomed in their lives, if not during the war, after the war. So, you know, we're going back to that initial question about getting to the man behind the physically imposing boxer. Where do you think Reg began to show signs of depth? Is that perhaps is a good way?
Okay. So I'm going to touch on compassion in a moment, but I'm also going to touch on intelligence before I get to that. So at the end of 1942, he's sent with B Squadron to assist a patrol, or there was a series of patrols taking place on the coastal highway of Libya as the Allies are now moving forward. And they're sent in advance, the SAS, to carry out small patrol insertions, blow up transport park-ups, mine the roads. So Reg goes ahead with one of these parties, carries out several of these successful attacks further up from Buarat, actually. So you've got Buarat there above Tammet. The coastal road stretches away northwest into Tripolitania, which is where Reg is operating. Now, this is a particularly tough and arduous time in his life. Across the end of 42, start of 43, they lose the officer that's with them, Captain Hor Ruthven, who is killed or who dies. There's a chapter about it in the book, and Seekings gets them back. Okay, so Seekings gets his patrol back. Now, a lot of these other patrols, and there were 16 of them sent out across the certain specific stretches of that coastal highway. Not all of them returned. A lot of them were captured. But Seekings brings his patrol back. He gets back, and Generals Harding and Freiberg consult him. That's how high Reg's opinion is now evaluated at. Okay, so this was a guy who a year and a half earlier was lowly private status. He's now Sergeant Seekings at this point. He does rise to a squadron sergeant major, but at this point, he's Sergeant Seekings. And one evening, he goes into conference with them. And again, he writes about it in these notebooks, which is, just invaluable for me. And Reg describes his thrill at sitting with two great generals. And he's asked about the Allies' maps, about enemy troop positions. They pick his brains, and it's fascinating for Reg to listen to these two generals planning the attacks on Tripoli, Misurata, and up that Libyan coastal highway. But that is a level that perhaps Reg hasn't been considered at before. As we've said, he's the brawny boxer, sporting prowess, great stamina, hard, tough. But here he is, sat in conference with two Allied generals of high repute and standing, and it thrills Reg to get that access and to have that conversation. So we're finding out there about
this in all the books. Sorry to interrupt. We get this in the books. With Gavin Mortimer and Damien Lewis, is that, of course, there's this almost constant rough and tumble action of blowing things up, whether it's North Africa or Europe and Italy and Sicily. But the intelligence of the guys that prospered in the SAS always comes through in the books. It came through in the bits of your book I read last night about Reg, and I think that's where sometimes TV and even maybe documentaries or YouTube film, they kind of condense these characters to these, gun-toting, brilliant soldiers, but don't really get across that Sterling and Mayne are also, themselves, they're choosing people who have higher than average levels of intelligence, because you've got to have those qualities too. And I think that's what sometimes these shows are lacking, failing to present.
So absolutely, and I'd read in one book where a fellow SAS original had called Reg something along the lines of dour and not too intelligent, and I thought, he's not got to grips with who Reg Seekings really was. And Generals Harding and Freiberg could see it and wanted to consult Reg, as did others at certain other points. Sterling knew, Paddy Mayne knew. And there is a level of intelligence there that I think possibly hasn't been a light hasn't been shone upon it before, just as the same as a light hasn't been shone on Reg's compassion. He was someone who had a humanity about him. He was brought up well by his mother and father. He cared, and I think that was shown, absolutely shown internally. October the 5th, 1943, he's the head in reserve. The SRS, as they've been repurposed at that point, were fighting against a counterattack by elements of the German Panzer Division. And so they were the head in reserve, but the message had come down, prepared to go out and join that sort of thin defensive perimeter line outside the west of Termoli. Obviously, Termoli had been taken on October the 3rd, but the Germans launched this devastating counterattattack. And so Reg is by the tailgate of that truck that you see there in the picture. And they're waiting to go. And Reg is feeling nervous at that point, because he's sure there's an OP and that they're ranging their shells into the vicinity. And sure enough, there's the devastation caused by one that just before 3 o'clock on that afternoon, devastating confusion, chaos, and destruction on that Italian side street. And so Reg, he was either the first responder or one of the first. Incredibly lucky, because that's the other aspect of Seekings that we will address, how fortunate he was, how much good luck he had. On this occasion, he escaped with a damaged fingernail. It beggars belief, really, doesn't it, that when you look at that scene there, that Reg, who was blown away from the back of the tailgate, escaped with a damaged fingernail. And as a result of that awful shell, 18 of his comrades would be buried, and would be killed. But before they could be buried, Reg had, as part of the response, had picked up dismembered limbs. How do I know this? Well, I spoke to Reg had mentioned it in his interviews with Gordon Stevens, but the family of Eric Musk gave me Eric Musk's handwritten memories of that time, and he actually writes, Sergeant Seekings collected the arms legs, heads, and made sure they were together. So, and then we buried the men. And he wrote them in really matter-of-fact prose because it must have affected Eric Musk. But that's the depth of Reg. That's how much he cared for those men. That there had to be dignity in what had befallen them all, and he took it on his own shoulders to walk around those scenes. And I remember listening to Reg, and he was telling me limbs were on telephone wires, roofs, and he went around and found those dismembered limbs and gave them, as I say, the dignity they deserved in that moment of tragedy for the SRS SAS in October 1943. So these are levels that haven't necessarily been focused on. It's been known about that Reg was part of the response there, but the handwritten notes that Eric Musk's family gave to me confirm it. And I think that, you know, Reg should be seen on that level. We were discussing it, weren't we? The depth, the perception, but actually the real man. And that's the real man right there.
I mean, I'm going to urge people again to go and get the book. But I mean, I read that chapter last night. I specifically looked up the Termly chapter, and, you know, seeing one of his comrades, you know, burned to death. That there's the family there that had done some laundry for the guys, and the fact that they were victims as well. But I think the bit that really affected me was this. There's that expression in the military, on the bus, off the bus, because you're always hurry up and wait in the military. But this was a classic but tragic example of that, on the bus, off it, because there had been this argument over who was taking which truck, who was going in which bin, which sergeant's doing this, and minutes are passing, and you relate how Reg is aware that the town is being observed and the Germans could direct fire, and there's an avoidability about this tragedy that I think Reg, from my interpretation, and the fact that he survived. Survivor's guilt combined with frustration at the avoidability of the accident, and then the horror of the aftermath. It's a perfect storm of trauma that would live with a person for the rest of their lives.
Overwhelming frustration, and you hear it in those interviews that Reg conducted in the 1980s. You hear it in his voice. You know, I was going on earlier about how his sure, solid assertions, they were never more apparent than when he was reflecting on Termly. And Termly, of all the incidents, of the many incidents and contacts and engagements with the enemy, this was definitely the one that I think had a profound effect on him, because all those years later, you can see it in the television interview that is used in Ben's excellent documentary. You can see it, and the slowness of his words as he says, Termly was bad. Termly was terrible. And you just know he felt it. And Reg wasn't. I did glimpse through, because I know you asked me to look at the episode 4. I got to episode 2 of the second series, but haven't got around to watching the rest of it yet. But I did watch how Reg was depicted in episode 4 this morning before we spoke, and you know, it suggested that Reg suffered at that time with was suffering from the stress and trauma of combat. Now, I don't think that was the case at all, and nobody I spoke to suggested Reg was feeling, you know, though he may, but he wasn't showing them. That television series, I don't think in that episode captured how Reg reacted, and the relationship with the Italian family isn't something that he discussed on the audio. There was a laundry, there was a family who were carrying out laundry services for the men, but I don't believe that Reg forged any bond or had any friendship with the family as showcased in that episode. And I don't think, from everyone I've talked to, that Reg, he was that person who was incredibly tough and had coping mechanisms. He had developed extraordinary coping mechanisms which enabled him to continue. It must have touched him, but it wasn't apparent to anyone around him.
Yeah, I mean, this is that we're going into a massive, great rabbit hole about how TV works, but it's that the TV series using Reg's character to tell a wider, bigger and, in frankly, an important story of how men deal with combat. But as people are saying in the sidebar, we must, remind ourselves that TV is TV and the reality is somewhat different. And I think we want to. It's not a great time to move on to his relationship with the Padre, because again in the series, people might have this perception of him being one of the blokes. He was always there with the other ranks and the other sergeants, but he had these other friendships and relationships. To explain a little bit more about this.
So 1944, the SAS is reorganized under Roderick MacLeod in Darvel, and it massively expanded. Hugely expanded. So from that force of 60 odd in August 1941, we're now talking about the Special Air Service Brigade of around 2,500 men being built up in the first months of 1944. So in comes Padre McCluskey, and Reg, sort of, I can imagine him. There's a quote from him in one of the audio reels, along the lines of, "Parsons didn't interest me." And I can imagine him being rather dismissive on seeing Padre McCluskey. However, you couldn't really imagine at that point just how the change in that relationship over the coming months, because it's actually McCluskey who initially nurses Reg when he's shot in the base of his skull, the cavity between the top of his spine and the base of his skull. He was shot there in the Morvan, June the 27th, 1944. There was the Battle of Vermo, as it was known, across a valley. Reg had come up from an area of cover, and at the last as he popped his head up, he sees an enemy gunner protecting transport, and he gets shot. But it's McCluskey who helps him through the next week, to the point that he even gives Reg a shave. And through that recovery process, the weeks and months of Operation Houndsworth that summer, he gets to know McCluskey and realizes, and again his quote, that this man was giving the men of A Squadron something rather wonderful. That was how Reg perceived what the unarmed McCluskey was doing. We talked about Mike Sadler's lightness of touch. It's exactly the same here with McCluskey. He had a warm word and support, and Reg and he would have lots of long conversations to the point where there were various Bibles and around, but Reg said, you got to get some Lemmy Caution in here. Now Lemmy Caution was a detective figure, a hard-boiled sort of American detective, and so as a result of that, they managed to get some of those books about this detective dropped in. And by the end of that summer, so by September 1944, when Seekings returned to Essex, by this point SAS were moving on to Highlands House in Chelmsford. They were firm friends, and that continued for the rest of their lives. There was a special bond between the two men.
Brilliant. And the fact that you said he got this sense of duty from his father, and his father's carrying on despite the injuries he got in the First World War, is that obviously those who are only familiar with the TV series, it only takes us up to the last episode is beginning D-Day. But of course, Reg is there from the beginning to the kind of the bitter end, in a sense, and goes to all those campaigns. And so if he'd showed any fragility halfway through the war, he didn't let it stop him doing what he had to do. He carried on being an incredibly important, vital, respected member of the unit, as you correctly said, a unit that is vastly bigger and running differently than it had. It has become a proper army regiment by 44, and some of the originals don't quite fit in with the new SAS because it is a little bit more rigid, and although we mustn't forget the fact that Paddy Mayne and others had instilled discipline right at the beginning, it wasn't this wild group of men that sometimes we think it is, but he adapts to the thoroughly professional larger size of SAS, doesn't he?
He does, and he's a very important figure because Paddy Mayne asked him to take commission in early 1944. Reg refuses. He says, "Will you take warrant officer status?" And Reg says, "Yes, that's what I want." He becomes Squadron Sergeant Major, which is right at the heart of the action, where he wants to be. And I should say, I don't think there was any fragility about Reg. I don't think there was a hint of it. I think he was as tough as they come. I think he had an incredibly full skill set, coping mechanisms, initiative, drive, decision making. I think he was the complete soldier. I know that's a big statement, but as near as, because he saw more action than many from 1941 through to 1945. As you correctly identified, he was there to the end. That's a picture of him there in Germany in the spring of 1944, camera around his neck. And I should just say, Reg was crafty, very, very cunning man. He'd recognised that so he was part of a field security patrol that was deputed to identify and find suspected Nazi war criminals. One in particular, they had identified the mistress of the man, but they couldn't get from her the whereabouts of where this adjutant was. So Reg goes away, has a think, pops into the chemist to pick up some pictures. And while he's in there, he says to the chemist, "Is there any chance you can doctor up an image and and put a good-looking woman on the lap of this picture of this officer that we're seeking?" "Oh yes," says the chemist, "I can do that." So with that new piece of evidence, he then interrogates the woman again, and it's the classic, "Do you mean to say you don't know who this man is?" She sees the picture, sees the good-looking girl on the lap of this man who she thought was her lover, and she spills the beans. Photoshop modifications years before their time, and Reg has identified the whereabouts of this suspected Nazi they're pursuing. So that's the sort of cunning we're talking about, alongside the brawn. And so there was, as I attest, a full skill set in the man that was getting sharper, not diminishing, with every passing month and year of the war.
It's absolutely brilliant to hear your insight into this, because when I'm saying that he may or may, well, you're saying he didn't have any fragility. Even if he did, it wouldn't be any score against him. I mean, it would be remarkable that anybody would go through the war without it affecting them in some way, shape or form. And we know people who did perform incredibly well, but have problems dealing with the situations perhaps in the years that followed after war there. But that photo there is just a classic photo that if you can draw a character from a photo, that's kind of the one you can draw it from. I mean, just tough, uncompromising, honest. I mean, how many more superlatives do you want me to list in that photo there? Extraordinary photo.
It's a great photo, isn't it? And while we've seen the pictures of him in North Africa with his unkempt, wild hair, there he actually looks dashing, doesn't he? He looks like a handsome tough. And the good news about this story is he got through to the end of the war, as did Bob, as did their great pal Eric Musk, and he came home, and in the summer of 1945 married Monica in the village church in Suffolk. In fact, in the village where he lived his final years. They eventually moved back there, and so there was an end goal. He got to where he wanted to be. He got home and married the woman in his life, and they were together for 50 years plus.
This is a really trite, terrible interviewer's question now that I feel embarrassed for putting it to you, but I'm going to anyway. If he'd lived into the era of internet, and as you talked about at the beginning, the Gavin Mortimer books and Ben McIntyre, because obviously the SAS was regarded as something special, when he was doing the interviews back in the 80s, but there's something even more about them now, with all the success of not just the TV series, but video games and things like that. What do you think he would think of the interest in his life and the SAS in we are now 80 years on from these events?
It's funny you should ask, because while he would always call a spade and was definitely someone who had very strong opinions, and if he disagreed with you, would tell you, in the main, the people that I knew who really knew Reg late in life reflected on him as fairly quiet, measured, not a rough, tough, shouty ranter and raver. So I think he would look at it with a little bit of bemusement and, you know, might just a wry smile. Can't quite believe that we're still getting talked about all these years later. Again, I'm guessing in the way that the question was slightly, as you said, a slightly trite question. My answer's slightly trite.
I fully take that it is a trite question. Yeah.
And I'm kind of guessing here. Of course, I'm conjecturing, but I think he would look back a little bit amused, a little bit bemused, kind of scratching his head quietly in the pub in Stanton, where he'd have a nice quiet pint of bitter and just pass the time of day. No thoughts of grandeur. By the way, when he was with the police anti-terrorist unit in southern Rhodesia, I got to speak to someone who Reg trained, and he never spoke a word about anything he'd ever done before. He was an incredibly modest man, and to a point where these young officers that he was training, who is this English guy? Who is he? What's he done? Because Reg didn't go around talking about it. It wasn't as if he thought he was doing anything, done anything that merited special conversation or special respect. So I think if you are 80 odd years later, the fact that the legend is growing with all these men, not diminishing, I think he'd raise an eyebrow and smile. But inside, someone rang me who knew him late in life, and they said he'd have thought you did all right with his book. He'd have thought you did all right with that, and that was high praise for me. That the fact that Reg might consider that was a fair reflection of the man's life, and that he'd have thought you'd have done that was a good book. And
for any non-Brits watching, someone saying something's all right can actually be quite high praise. Yeah, it was all right. Yeah, you know, did you have a good evening? Yeah, was the meal nice? Yeah, it was all right. That can actually be quite high praise. So, well, Tony, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you, because the more you learn about these characters, the more you realize just what a diverse bunch of people they were, and perhaps we're all a little bit still dealing with the David Sterling version of the SAS, who was something of a show off. And I don't think there's anything bad about us saying that. And the Phantom Major stories that were circulating in the years after war, and maybe although the SAS clearly is David Sterling's baby, with Lewis and Bill Sterling, all these and Maine all being involved, is that these more unassuming, solid, dependable, there all the way through guys were maybe more representative of the whole of that unit than perhaps the showy ones.
I think the fact that I know that Reg is still highly thought of in the regiment to this day. The example he set is still discussed. He's still his repute grows. It doesn't diminish, as I say. He'll never be forgotten. He's one of the hard to say. He's one of the greats, isn't he? He's one of the SAS.
One of the immortals, I guess, in the SAS. I mean, it's that, when I did the panel show with Damien Lewis and Chris Ryan and even all these years later, other men who have served with incredible distinction in special forces, battling their own wars, still look at these originals as, in a way we can't compete with these guys, because they had to invent the unit ethos. They had to invent the reputation. There was no reputation. As we talked about before with about Dudley Clark. I mean, the SAS were given the name the SAS because it had been created as a fictitious unit. So the fact they built a reputation based on a unit that they weren't even supposed to be is extraordinary. and now we're talking generations later, people still looking back at the Jim Armans and the Reg Seekings and the Johnny Coopers and of these guys that paved the way when they didn't even know what the route was they were paving, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and it's been everyone gets a stroke of good fortune in their lives. Reg's was when he survived the bullet to the back of his head. Mine was getting the opportunity to fully research and write about this man. My good fortune was that nobody had done it before, because it's meant that I was just drilling down on a subject that was well worth consideration. And I remember talking to the SAS Regimental Association and then really being supportive, because this was a figure that they felt should have a book written about him, and I really hope that I've done him justice.
Well, brilliant stuff. So it's been fantastic talking to you, Tony. So I think I'm going to hold up my copy there. So folks, the link is in the description below, or buy it at your favorite bookstore or online retailer, whatever you want to do. But maybe there are people thinking they've already got plenty of SAS books. There's room for another one on your shelves, because this is an extraordinary one that by focusing on just one soldier and his immediate circle gives us something that perhaps the other books in their more all-encompassing ways don't do. So I urge you to go and get it. So thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. I'm back again later today, debunking some of the myths about the US Airborne on D-Day. But in the meantime, don't forget to click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. But in the meantime, this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.